On today's episode, me and my friend Taylor Dall will be discussing Dungeons and Dragons, created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in 1974, but more specifically, the role of the Dungeon Master, who acts as the game's referee and storyteller. But before we start, I just want to say that there is an error in the episode today. I say that Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't be invented for decades after the 70s, but it was actually created in 1974, as I just stated. I'm working as my own fact checker and editor, and I just want to be transparent with all of you. So let's get right into it on today's episode of The Bomb with AUZZYNAPALM. Welcome back to The Bomb with AUZZYNAPALM, the most explosive podcast in Kingston, Ontario. And everyone, I am very excited to share my very first episode. And I couldn't be more excited for my first guest today. He's a really old friend of mine, and we share a passion and hobby together, which you'll be hearing more about. But first, let me just introduce today's guest, Taylor Dall. Taylor, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, no, I'm happy to be here. My name's Taylor. I'm a pencil-pushing bureaucrat from municipal government, and I've shared the same hobby of D&D for about 10 years now, I think.
Yeah, I'd say actually I've been playing for around the same time, and let's just get right into it off of that. Like most people, I think my introduction to D&D was through mainstream media, in the sense that it was kind of regarded as like the creme de la creme, as nerdy as one could be. And even my dad, who wasn't into that sort of thing, growing up, I remember even him cracking jokes about Dungeons and Dragons. So for yourself, Taylor, what was your first introduction to D&D? Not necessarily as a player experience, but your first introduction to Dungeons and Dragons as an entity.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It was always kind of reserved as, I think, that point of no return, or that pinnacle of nerdiness from which, there is no return. I want to say that my first introduction was just seeing it depicted in popular TV shows. Remember Disney's Recess? They had that episode with the pale kids who had never been in an episode before because they never went out for recess. They were always playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. The one I was going to reference is a favorite of mine. That 70s show had a similar episode where the cooler kids were making fun of the D&D kids. I remember that one as well. Which didn't make sense historically, as Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't be invented for a couple decades, but
Well, it's funny, yeah. I think it's often depicted as that weird outsider culture in any sort of media, whether it's live action TV shows, cartoons, even, or movies. I mean, now we're starting to see it creep into more and more mainstream media. Stranger Things is the most common, or the big popular example now. But yeah, it was just even in shows before, it would be depicted in one episode, and I think you almost had to kind of know to look for it even to notice it.
Well, with that being said, and you bringing up Stranger Things, kind of bringing it to light in the the last few years here, like we said at the start, we've both been playing for about a decade now. What was your what led you into actually playing the game? What was your first experience? How did you land on Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, I'd always been kind of a fantasy nerd, for lack of a better word. I was always interested in fantasy books, especially growing up. And when I was about 13 years old, I remember just walking into the fantasy section of the bookstore that I would always go to, this little locally owned place. And I remember I turned around, and there on the shelf opposite, where I'd never looked before, was just a bunch of D&D books. And I remember picking up the starter edition box and going up to my mom, who was with me at the time, and just saying can I get this? And then she immediately replied with, "Isn't that the Satan game?" And I think you laugh because we all know that that satanic panic meme from back in the day, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But, at the time, I just, with absolutely no context, I said no. And and she just bought it for me, and like that was my intro to D&D. I got that box home, opened it up, I pulled out some weird file folio things of rules, a couple of pre-generated characters, some cardboard cutouts of like gelatinous cubes and map packs and stuff, and a bunch of dice that were oddly shaped. I spent about 20 minutes with it before I realized that I have absolutely, like, it's like Greek, right? I have no idea what I'm looking at. And I like packed it back up, put it under my bed, and I think I didn't go back to D&D for like 7 more years.
Yeah, well, as much as I wish I had it around when I was younger, it's a very cost-effective game once you have the actual materials. It's all paper and imagination. But as much as I think I would have liked to have had it when I was younger, like you said, absolute just different language at first. So I'm thankful that my first experience was actually in my college years. I was in my early 20s, and I had a group of actually, like, really the academia type that you wouldn't expect to be into Dungeons and Dragons, let alone all the other games we'd play together, Magic the Gathering, for example. But I remember we played Magic for a few years together before one night I heard them, say they couldn't play cards that night because they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. At first, I actually thought they were joking because these guys were cool guys, They partied, they drank, they smoked. And so, when I kind of questioned them about it, they instantly invited me out to see what it was like. And after just sitting and watching for like 30 minutes, I asked, how can I get in on this? Because I've always been into theater and improv, and this just seemed like taking all the things that I already loved, like you mentioned, fantasy and, sci-fi and all that. The elements were all there, and I was hooked just from watching 30 minutes of a bunch of guys in a danky smoke-filled room, talk about nothing that existed, nothing. And that's the really brilliant part about this, is it's the collective imagination that creates it all.
Yeah, it's like that collaborative storytelling, right? When I have a very similar reintroduction into D&D. When I was in university, I was at one of those club fairs where they try and recruit you to the different clubs, polo and skydiving and all that weird stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's this table of guys who are like setting up, like, they've got like Star Trek standees, and it's kind of like that stereotypical look. I think that's what they were going for because they're trying to attract that crowd. But they're out there and they were like the tabletop role playing club, and I said, well, what are you guys about? And then they just didn't even tell me like about D&D or Shadowrun or anything like that, like any specific game or system. They're like, we are about experiences and collaborative games. And, they immediately go into stories about, all the crazy adventures they've had. And I'm just like, sign me up. Like, I want that. I want that, that world where anything I can think of, anything I put out there into the world is a possibility. And then the dice just take care of the rest.
Well, and absolutely, I agree with that. And that's one of the things I think we'll get into a bit later when we start talking about the dungeon mastering itself a little more. But one of my favorite rules that I always come back to, even when I'm playing, when I'm running a session, is right there in bold letters. At the end of the day, the DM say goes, because, it's the world you are creating for everyone to be in. And I find the supplements and the books that are put out, yeah, they're more of a guideline. They're not meant to be followed to the T like some people think. And
I'd agree with that. Yeah, I've always been a member of the school of, if you're having fun, you're doing it right. And I think that's a royal you, right? That's everybody at the table. If everybody's having fun, it doesn't matter that you haven't looked at the encumbrance rules since session 1. Hey, everybody comes back the next week and they've got smiles on their faces.
And that is actually how I try to go about creating my sessions. And that's actually what led me into starting to DM myself. Is I had a group of friends, and we were either all leftovers from old sessions or people who had heard about D&D, and the fact they had friends who played made them really want to get into it. So I one day just took it upon myself to grab the DMG, research as much as I could on Google and YouTube, see how other people did it. And, within the month, I had session 1 ready for, we had a big group. It was eight guys, but that's actually how I started DMing, was just, the necessity for someone to actually run the sessions.
Yeah, and let me just ask this: Are you like a forever DM now?
I always make the joke, once a bridesmaid, never a bride. And I'm sure you go through the same thing. I've maybe in the last 10 years played 5-6 sessions, and I've ran 100 plus.
Yeah, I say I've been playing D&D for about 10 years now, and easily the last 7 to 8 of those years have been about 99% DMing. I think I could count on one hand the amount of times I've not DM'd. But, you got to take it as one of two things, or maybe both, that it's a compliment that people want to keep playing in your games, and B, it's something that you clearly enjoy doing. Like my time is valuable, and I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't like it.
Well, and that was actually one of the things that I was most worried about when I started to write, is how much are they going to enjoy the story I'm telling? But then week after week, everyone was asking, when's the next session? When's the next session? And that alone is enough to make you want to keep DMing. Like you said, it's a very big compliment. And as much as, I pine to play again, getting stuck in the DM role, it's not the worst. I can't complain, because it's like you said earlier, it's a lot of fun. And if you can necessitate the fun for the group, like, why not do it?
Yeah, I mean, I got into DMing, I think, for kind of similar reasons. Like, I wanted to play D&D, and you need someone to DM, and hey, like, I'm happy to do it if it keeps us all playing, right?
Well, absolutely. Keeping everyone playing is the 100% goal. But now I have a question for you, because I know we both like to follow the Dungeons and Dragons memes, and a lot of them are centered around actually getting a group together. In your experience, how difficult is it to run reoccurring sessions, say, every other week or even once a month?
I mean, I think just by its very nature, everything about a D&D game kind of varies based on the group you have. But in this case, it is kind of, I feel like it falls uniquely on the DM as usual to kind of be that linchpin, right? To hold everything together and to schedule everybody. I've been pretty lucky with the group I have lately. But I have lost a few groups, just to schedules conflicting and only meeting, once a month, and then just losing that momentum. And before you know it, you haven't met in 3 months, and the next time you meet, you're forgetting half the stuff you need to recap, and then the story just falls apart. So I've been there. I think I've definitely learned a lot of strategies, and I think it comes right down to just bold-faced, like, you have to ask people, like, outright to commit, right? And you have to make it worth their time. And while I'm not going to go out there and say that it's the DM's duty to, people aren't entitled to the DM's entertaining them, but if you're going to run a game, like, you got to put in the work, right, to make sure that table meets.
Yeah, and absolutely, it does fall onto the DM to be that linchpin. The difficulty, though, that I find is just, life gets in the way. And as we touched on earlier, even though D&D was always portrayed as the, as nerdy as something can get, the amount of, like, different people who actually play it's always astounding to me. And in our group alone, we had someone works with the government. We had someone else who was a contractor. I myself at the time was a sous chef at a restaurant here in town. So it's different walks of life, and trying to make all these schedules have one day in a certain block that matches up is nearly impossible, I find, especially once you try to account in social groups, partners, and children, especially now getting into this age.
We're not free like we were in high school anymore. My group's pretty similar, just complete variation in professions. We've got a military guy, a computer developer, a lawyer. My partner plays in it. She's a nurse. And then myself, and I'm like your typical 9 to 5 guy. So it's like we are doomed to fail, it would seem, but we somehow manage to meet every Thursday at 7 p.m.
Well, absolutely. And then the thing that I always would run to and is at work is if I try to book off a Sunday, because that seemed to be the easiest days for my group. If I booked off a Sunday and they would ask why, and if they found out it was for D&D, not only would you get ridiculed a little bit, the chances are you wouldn't get it off because they wouldn't deem it a necessity, which is strange, when other coworkers, if they need to go, to a party or something, that's less of a faux pas, it seems, when it's realistically the same thing. That's one of the main attractions for me as well. Is I always describe D&D as the modern day poker night, where it's just you, a bunch of friends getting together, playing a game. And even though it's a game you're getting together to play, it's the experience and the time spent together that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people get out of it different things. Like I personally, my job is so mundane, but in D&D, it's like that fantastic escapism, right? And I get to be the architect of a world, whereas otherwise I'm just kind of pencil pushing throughout the week. And then I have, friends who have very stressful jobs, and they're like, I just want to get out there and go full rage, bear totem, and just go to town on some goblins. I need that right now. You get out of it what you need, right?
Well, with that being said, too, with so much variety that needs to go into a session, how do you actually go about writing your sessions and campaigns so that it remains not only interesting for yourself, but for every player who they're all trying to accomplish different things, because even though their alignments might be similar, their backgrounds are all going to be so varied that, the one character might want to go save the elven princess, but the dwarf might not really be into that. You know what I mean? So how do you go about writing sessions that keeps it cooperative for everyone?
Well, as I said, like I have a 9 to 5 job, so I have some regular availability to write, but still not quite enough that I feel comfortable doing a lot of homebrew anymore. So I usually start off with like a published adventure, either something from like the DM's Guild or something directly from Wizards of the Coast if I'm running 5th edition D&D. And from that, I'll tend to build. And I'm a big fan of the session zero, getting everybody in the room to discuss kind of what the bare bones of the campaign are, and then talk about what their characters are, what their expectations are of the game, what kind of development they'd like to have in their character. And I like to take those notes and then build and kind of weave those into the story as written. So, for instance, right now I'm writing Rime of the Frost Maiden, and in that there's a subplot about this mysterious mineral / ore called Chardelin, and one of my characters is a dwarf who has fled his family, who were like cultists who had like some dark religion, and we managed to work in Chardelin into his religion, and it's actually had me rewriting a lot of the last couple chapters of the book. But again, like you said, it's really it's all tied into what that character's expectations are for the game and like what they want to get out of it. And
well, I really like what you said about session zero, because that one is, I believe, as much as a cliche as it can get sometimes. Without it, a lot can just fall apart. If the group doesn't have that clear purpose of why they're working together off the get-go, that I find a lot of groups actually fall apart because of that, without that necessity to work together. So when I'm writing a campaign or a session, I always try to make it that whatever happens in session zero is important from then on. Even if it's something as little as like two characters both like to gamble, I'll try to make that a focus going forward. But I do like what you said, where you take the pre-made ones that are there for you. I actually do it very similar, where I will write my own homebrew, but work in elements of things I find. Reddit is one of my favorite resources. Just hearing what other DMs have to say, puzzles or tips and tricks, stuff like that. It's been a really big help over the years learning how to do this.
Yeah, I usually with the big published adventures, the official ones from Wizards, you'll see like a whole subreddit dedicated to that. So like for Rime of the Frost Maiden, there's a subreddit there, and I'm regularly in on those discussions talking about, hey, listen, I'm reworking chapter 3, and I want to change, X to X plus Y, and will that work out? And people saying like, oh no no no, don't do that, I'm on chapter 4, and it will all fall apart if you don't rewrite it too.
Well, that's actually one of my, as a DM, personal biggest pet peeves when it comes to other DMs is the inability to budge for your players within reason, if that makes sense. So, for example, I had a drunken monk in one of my campaigns, and he was really big into the role play side of things. And he asked off the get-go if somehow he could incorporate his flask and just like drunken movements to be his attack for a monk. And normally I find like, because he wanted to use technically something that's not a weapon and use his, the staggering and so forth to his advantage, that maybe a lot of DMs who play by the book wouldn't be for that. But I was so into that idea. Like we workshopped it before we even did a session so that it all made sense and that he could role play that character to the best his ability.
Yeah, I'm definitely part of that camp of the yes and or the no but dungeon master. So yes, you can do that, and the it's gonna do bludgeoning damage because it's a flask, right? Or actually, yes, and it's gonna be silvered because your flask is made out of silver. So think about how that might affect the next encounter with a ghost or a lycanthrope or something like that.
That's a really good way to actually go about it. Yes, but, or no, and is that how you put it?
Yeah, yes and no but I mean really any mixture of those is going to work out for you, right? Just being flexible, like you said. I don't really like it when my dungeon masters have been kind of inflexible with me. I think at the end of the day, it's again that rule of cool, and if you're having fun, you're doing it right. And when I'm kind of weighing those options in my head, when somebody asks me something outlandish, really all I really consider is, will this negatively affect the enjoyment of someone else at the table? And if not, then why would I say no?
And that's how I go about it as well. But this also is kind of trying to, like, in a way, tying into one that I've been meaning to ask you. What How do you go about the nature of a crit fail? So rolling a 1 on your d20, or a nat 20, so rolling the 20. How do you go about dealing with that with players who have been almost trained to think that their crit 20 is going to accomplish anything they're trying, or their crit fail might automatically, be the worst thing to ever happen to them? How do you deal with that? Because I find that's actually one of the biggest issues that arises at my tables, is the misunderstanding of a crit 20, thinking it's automatically going to accomplish a goal.
Yeah, so I think it's become a meme, right? The nat 20 just bends the laws of physics and nature. I think as published, you can't actually have a crit success on a skill check. I think that's the way the rules are written. And again, as I've said before, I'm not really a rules lawyer DM. Like if it's fun, then sure, why not? But I usually try.
I've honestly been rules lawyered as a DM by my players more often than I rules lawyer my players, in all honesty.
Yeah, fair enough. That I can agree with that. That's probably that would statistically shake out with me too. But I try and have that conversation as part of my session 0. Usually in my session 0, I'll take a moment to explain, or I'll put aside a time to explain some new mechanics of my game, and I'll usually remind people of some other kind of less talked about or less common mechanics. So that might be something I bring up then, where I say, listen, guys, you can crit on an attack or on a spell, but you can't, or like, a spell attack, but you can't crit on a skill check because it's just bizarre. It has like the ramifications of some of that stuff is absurd. I think you and I were talking earlier, and I mentioned that in the middle, we'd split my party, or the party of my group last night was split up. Half of them were engaged in combat, and the other one was role playing with an NPC outside of the dungeon. And he was like, I just kind of went back to him out of combat and said, well, what are you doing? What are you discussing with this NPC? And he's like, I want to tell him about the history of the fall of the Netherese Empire. And I thought, okay. And he's like, well, how much do I know about it? I said, well, roll me a Arcana or a history check, like, well, tell me give me an idea as to how much you know. And he crits on it. And I think, okay, well, here's the wiki article that's about 5 pages long. And that to me, that was actually fairly easy to manage. But if he actually goes out and reads that whole article, God help me, I'm going to be in some trouble for like the later sessions, because he's got way too much knowledge for Rime of the Frost Maiden now.
Well, the one that I always find being an obstacle is on the checks, like you said, is say a wizard crits the Arcana. They just can't seem to accept that it's something beyond them as the explanation. It's always almost becomes like a child, but I rolled a 20. And my response usually is something like, yes, and that's an ancient dragon who is about 1,000 years older than you. I don't know what you want out of me here.
Yeah, I usually look at it as kind of like that standard deviation to get mathy about it. Like a nat 20 to me on a skill check is like you're a whole like, you're in the top 10 percentile of people who would know about that maybe. But still that top 10% is going to elude you, right? Because there has to be something else out there. Somebody just can't, walk around making Arcana checks all day, or making, science checks or medicine checks all day and discover penicillin walking down the street, right?
No, and as much as I don't want to get into the deep fundamentals here of the game, with the recent changes made to 5th edition, I find a lot of those new changes actually help with this issue, because they've done a lot of groundwork in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything to make NPCs more than just the bartender, more than just the blacksmith. They've given you so many resources now to work with that help you, even as the DM, understand these people are all just as important as the players in your group. And I think these are, at first I was a little hesitant because of the way they sounded, but once I got them in my hands, I was a big fan of these new changes.
Yeah, and they've done some similar stuff with the companions, and even as far back as Xanathar's Guide, that whole like this is your life tables series where you could roll and just quickly determine like the life history of somebody. I found I was using that for important NPCs that I was inserting into the game. Somebody said like, hey, does this person have any friends or siblings? And I roll on a table, and it's right there. It's right next to the same one where, did anything crazy happen to them when they were growing up? Yeah, their parents were lost at sea.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a necessity, because sometimes, sadly, telling your players it is just a bartender is not a good enough answer for them, and they will waste a lot of time trying to get as much as they can out of a certain NPC. But
I'm so glad to hear that.
Why are you glad to hear that?
Well, I'm just happy it happens to someone other than me.
I'm sure it happens to every DM out there. And we've actually had a few shared players in our group. I won't say names, but I think we can think of a few who are notorious for that. But something I actually did on my very first campaign that I found was super beneficial was, and again, I had a lot more time one-on-one with these players as we were friends, and when they came over, we had time to work on it. But one of the things I did was a backstory one-on-one session where we really fleshed out their history, because one of the things I first experienced as a player before I ever got into DMing, one of the players in our group would always complain that the DM wasn't doing anything for their character, which always struck me as an odd thing to complain about because you are as responsible as building your character as the DM is. But sorry, I didn't ever want to run into that. So something I did for each player was give them a backstory session to really help understood how they got to session one.
Yeah, is that just kind of an offshoot of a session zero then?
Yeah, so that's kind of how I went about session zero because I found it maintained uh, not only a good relationship with the players because it helped their character feel important off the get go, but it helped the characters kind of realize that everyone else they're working with was important too off the get go because even though they might not know how they ended up on the same mission, they know that they had to have something in common for them to end up there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that idea. I'm definitely going to steal that, I think, going forward.
Well, it's just one of the
I
little tricks that I, again, found on the internet for keeping the DM player relationship good and healthy. But what are some of the tricks you actually use to keep your relationships with your players? As I said, I refer to it as healthy. And what I mean by that is, like you said earlier, just fun. So they want to come back. So they're not salty when they leave the session. What do you do to keep the relationship good with so many different people?
I think the most important thing is just keeping that communication line open, right? And that often means, I think, as the DM, being the person who actually reaches out at the end of a session to say, hey, listen, notice you were kind of quiet today, or you seem really put out when, that role didn't go your way. Why was that such a big deal? Was that like, were you expecting that to be a big part of your character? I, like, let's talk about that.
Right. That's a nice way to do it too.
Yeah, so I like to try and keep that communication line open and to debrief with people and adjust on the fly, right? So like the game I started out with Rime of the Frost Maiden, in our session zero, I said, listen, guys, this is going to be a horror campaign. The elements are going to be out to get you. Like the normal is going to be out to get you. The paranormal is going to be out to get you.
Right.
And I've had debriefs since with my players who were, some of the players who were just so excited for like a really gritty and difficult game. And I'll debrief with them and say, hey, listen, you weren't doing a whole lot last session. And they just said like, oh, I was really scared that my character was going to die. Good start.
I mean, that is a valid reason to like play
yeah.
the back, but it's good that you checked that it wasn't something you did. It's not as much of a luxury for us anymore due to 2020 and the start of 2021 here, global reasons. But when sessions were able to be done in person, that, like you said, the debrief, I always kind of knew who didn't have a good time just based on who would leave right away. As you know, there's a lot of setup that goes into D&D, especially if you use minis and mats and whatnot. And sometimes a session might not end perfectly and you need to take pictures and, take a proper teardown. But that was always my giveaway, is who was out my front door first. That is kind of who I would reach out to later that night as well. Because usually the people who stuck around would just be, having a blast talking about what happened.
Yeah, they're holding on. They don't want the session to end, right?
And that's one of the things that has drawn me to this game for so long is to the people listening. If you haven't played, the best way I can explain the adrenaline rush you get out of it is very similar to if you play video games and you get a really good win, or even if you play sports, just that feeling of winning the game back in the locker room, just talking to the team about the plays and the moves that were made. Except with Dungeons and Dragons, the thing I find is, unlike a video game win that's over the next round when you start one, or a sports win even that's over the next time you start one, unless it's a championship, Dungeons and Dragons moments, if they are just really well done by everyone in the group, they stick with you like a real life memory. And 10 years in, my first session, there are moments that I tell, like, there's stories that happen to me because, I mean, technically, it was something that happened to me because it came out of the collective imagination of me and my friends.
Yeah, the and it'll surprise you. A lot of the players in my current game, at least I think three of them, three of the four in my game, have only been playing for a few years. So let's say they've been playing for 4 years now. I bet if you'd asked them 5 years ago, would you ever play Dungeons and Dragons? Their answer would probably be no. And now if you say like, hey, what's like the craziest thing that's happened to you in the last year? I would I'd say it's a toss up if that's a real moment or something that they happened at the D&D table. Like it's so
Absolutely.
impactful and they're so invested in it.
Well, and it's funny because as much as we've been, doing the rag on, saying D&D has always been classified as nerdy, like we said, with media kind of changing its attitude towards Dungeons and Dragons, as I've actually found in recent years, sorry, that in workplaces especially, if you're talking about Dungeons and Dragons with someone, you get the perking ears now, where it's almost like, oh, you play Dungeons and Dragons? I've almost kind of wanted to play. Maybe I can play with you.
Yeah, people are looking to have it kind of demystified now.
Demystified is a good way to put it. I was actually having a conversation earlier today with a friend that kind of shone a new light on this situation for me that I never considered. Is that he considers it too complicated to even try to breach into. I mean, we've been playing so long that it's easy to say, oh, I don't think that's an issue. But would you say that with 5th edition, how streamlined it's become, that it is complicated entry? Or would you say that if you have a group that could help you, it's quite simple?
I would say there's a lot of resources out there now that didn't really exist before. Um, when I think back to getting that 3rd edition box that I tried to cut my teeth on,
And sorry, just for the listeners, when we're referring to 5th edition, 3rd edition here, Dungeons and Dragons has been around so long with so many rules changes. It began as obviously 1st edition, and now all the way in 2021 here, we're on to 5th edition. Because of all the rules changes, how much gets added, so on and so forth. So when we're saying edition, that's actually what we're referring to. And if you're going to ask, maybe, is the game similar? Yes, but also each edition is so vastly different. It's like playing a completely new tabletop game, in my opinion. And sorry to cut you off there, Taylor. I just felt that we hadn't really mentioned what an edition is.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's good context. I think, yeah, as you said, the game fundamentally hasn't really changed. It's still that collaborative storytelling game that's got that medieval fantasy sort of vibe to it. But yeah, the rules they'll slowly change over time, and eventually the publishers they'll just say we want to change so much that let's just start from square one, publish a bunch of new books, and sell all those new books, and make a new edition. Well, I agree that 5th edition is a much easier one to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Well, I almost resented 5th edition when it came around, coming from 4.5. And it wasn't until I really started to play it and get into it that the things I thought I would miss from the earlier editions became not missed at all, and I realized they were integrated into the classes and races in such a way that I wasn't missing out on them.
Yeah, I think if you were a big fan of how mathy and strategic like 4th edition could be, or you kind of like that middle ground of 3rd or 3.5, like that halfway point between 3rd edition and 4th edition, you're free to like whatever you like.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I would say that 5th edition has done a very good job of streamlining the experience and making it accessible to new players, right? You don't have to know the difference between a flat-footed AC anymore versus a regular AC or a moving AC. It's made it, I think it's pared things down nicely, and it gives the DMs opportunities to make calls at the table, as opposed to like having so many rules they need to look back on, which kind of disrupts the flow of the game.
Right. Well, I
But
really like that you said AC, because that's another term that we're just so used to saying. AC stands for armor class, which is one of the attributes your character has. So, in agreement with my friend who said the game's complicated, when you first go to build a character, all the numbers and things they're throwing at you, absolutely. If you don't have a guide, it is so difficult. And even myself, Taylor can vouch because we just actually recently played a session together. Even after 10 years being on the DM side of things, when I go to make a character for myself to play, I struggle. It was like learning the game again. Just because if you don't keep on top of it, yeah, it's all these things you're not used to having to deal with. So I understand how that can be a little daunting. But if you have, again, like you said, the resources, I really find that it isn't as complicated as even myself still make it this day.
yeah, I think the biggest thing is now we are just like inundated with all these like live play YouTube channels and podcasts. When I was young and I had that third edition box, I had all these rules, but I didn't know what it was supposed to look like at the end of the day, right? I knew a bunch of people were supposed to sit around a table in somebody's basement, but I didn't know like what the DM's role was, how much a DM should talk compared to a player character. And I really just didn't understand like how combat would flow, why you weren't in combat all the time, because that's where the game's rules come from. And I was having a hard time putting it all together. But
Yeah,
now,
and it wasn't until I started dungeon mastering too that I realized actually how much work goes into that side of things. Let me ask you, how, on your average session, your Friday night session or whatever, how much hours do you put into one session on average for writing?
I feel like I front end load a lot of my writing. So when I get a new module that I'm going to, tweak and make work with my players, I bet I probably put a good 40 hours, like a full, work week over the span of like a month or so, into learning that module inside and out, meeting with players, talking about, what their expectations are, and then going back and stitching things together. And then week to week after that, I probably prep. I do a weekly session that's about 3 to 4 hours long, and I would say I probably prep 2 to 3 hours that week, and I would call that overkill.
Well, this is fun. This is actually why I wanted to have you as my guest, because I knew as dungeon masters we have a lot in common, but vary quite a bit. So you say you front end load, which is a great way to put it, because you deal a lot with the pre-built manuals. My session that ran for 3.5 years was all homebrew. So I found that because my party was so big, our once a month session or once every 2 weeks, depending when we could get games in, I found I was putting about 20 hours of writing spread between maybe 5 hours on 4 different nights into a single session. But with that being said, that was just because in the homebrew, there was really no telling where they would go, and I had to make sure that I had everything flushed out. With that being said, some weeks I would put in that 20 hours, and very little would actually be explored, so then I'd have that carryover going into the next one, and I'd maybe only have to do 1 or 2 hours of stitching together, as you put it. But I don't think a lot of people realize, especially when they're hounding dungeon masters to get a game going, how much actual not only work but time out of your day goes into getting it prepared.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like it's just, and I think the best way to I don't want to say combat that, because I don't think you should fight with your hobbies, but I would say like if I was going to give myself some advice on like going back to the games that I ran before, I would say, start out with a game that you're interested in, right? You're the DM, you have that control, and you obviously have to balance the interests of everyone else at the table as well. But if you're running a game that you enjoy, it's not going to feel like as much prep work. You know, like for me right now, writing the horror campaign of Rime of the Frost Maiden, sometimes I need to look at some paranormal books or paranormal podcasts or things like that to get inspiration to help flesh out things in the story. I mean, I'm into that, right? That's stuff that I like already. So when I spend 2 hours of my week reading a book on local ghost stories to add to the little towns, it doesn't feel like work, right? So, I mean, you know, I might admit to prepping 2 hours a week, but if I actually went back and did a thorough accounting of everything that eventually made its way into a game, it's probably a lot more than that. It just feels like fun.
And I'm on the exact same page. My world took a lot of influence from Tolkien, so I actually went out and bought a lot of his books that aren't the Lord of the Rings ones, ones written by other people, just to gain even more of that feeling of the land, because the way I like to write elves and dwarf relationships especially are just so Tolkien-esque. I can't even pretend that my homage isn't just cheap imitation at times, but with such a constructed world, it's nice to have that familiarity, because familiarity is actually one of the things I use in my writing. If it's just a town name or giving the NPC a name, that's something people are going to recognize just from their day-to-day. So, for example, in my session, the two major cities were Gotham and Metropolis. Cheesy, yes, but after that first initial haha, it's never an issue again. It's, oh, that person's in Gotham, you know, blah, 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 or that person's in Metropolis, yada, yada, yada. So as much as familiarity can be cliche, I do use quite a bit of it when I go to write, just because I find it sticks in the memory with the players easier.
Yeah, and that can help to flesh out things for the players too. I think as DMs, it's really easy for us to lose sight of what the players see, because we're so used to reading the source material, or we have something in our mind that's clear as day.
It's almost like Neo. We can see the code in the Matrix where
and maybe we don't communicate it as well as we think, right? Like I've had so many players, you know, say like, oh, okay, actually I'm going to stab this guy. The guy you're talking to in the street, the guy trying to sell you a newspaper. Yeah, I'm just going to stab him. There's no one else around, right? Yeah, it's a town of 10,000 people. And, oh, I thought it was just a little fishing village.
Well, and that clarity is like such a necessity. My very first session, because it was a homebrew and because I was still learning, the character I had set up to be their Kobayashi Maru fixer, like the one to get them out of the fuck situation, was actually, they took it and took my portrayal as, oh, this must be the bad guy. This dark hooded figure in the corner of the bar. Let's go start a fight with them. When really it was the high leveled elf princess sent to escort them to the next town. And no matter how many times I tried to talk my way out of it, they just were already set on that's the bad guy, and the fight had to go down. So my very first session changed so much in the writing I had done that went for years after that, as much as it was a bummer it happened, sometimes you can get yourself out of those moments.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to your character as a DM, right? To be flexible and to let the players shape the world to their liking as well. I think it shows a lot of maturity when you can say, you know what, you're absolutely right. That's exactly how it happens.
Well, my dungeon master for me, when I played for the first time, I don't know why I did it, but I had just come up with, my character was on a quest to find this weapon called the Hero's Blade. And the first time I brought it up, my DM gave me a look like, dude, what are you doing? And every session after that, I would just ask NPCs, hey, you see the Hero Blade? And this went on for a few months before finally someone in a random town said, well, I've probably heard the same rumors you have, but, you know, and then they informed me the rumors they had heard. So after 3 months of me just blindly sticking to this story that I thought was never going to pay off, it turned out my DM was actually working on something in the background. So I do really like to reward players for their creativity and the things they want to add. One of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to DMing is the expectation, though, that you create it all.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is like this pervasive expectation that the DM is responsible for your enjoyment at the table. And I think that's to take it a step further from what you're saying. But yeah, it's like I'm coming to your house, I'm playing with your books and your miniatures and everything, and you're entertaining me. It's like, as a DM, you're not getting paid. If you are, congratulations, you're living the dream,
Lucky, how do I sign up?
right? But yeah, it's everyone there is working together to make it interesting. If you're responsible for your own fun at the end of the day, and if that means playing the character the way that you need to, or if that means talking to the DM at the end of the day, like it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah, and we've already talked about a lot of the obstacles we run into as DMs, but is there maybe issues you run into that we haven't discussed already that you find even to this day working around them are difficult?
I would say that, like as I said, I try and keep those communication lines open, but every now and then I'll encounter a player who's just like completely like an enigma. Like you'll say like, "Hey, you didn't sound like you were having like too much fun today. Anything I can change?" No. And then a month later, they just stop showing up to games, and you're just left to wonder, okay, what happened there?
I'd say my
So
biggest obstacle is getting the rogue players in line. And I don't mean rogue the class, but I mean the players who just have decided I'm going to play my character this way, even though it's going against what the group's doing. I'm just going to stick to it. I'd say that's my biggest obstacle because I don't want to punish someone out of playing the character they want, but I also need to find a way to have it make sense. So, for example, I had a Dragonborn player in my campaign, and the running gag with Dragonborns in my world were they were very, very easy to pay off. And my Dragonborn stuck to that to a T. But, that would consist of him getting the group to write contracts to get him to do something simple, or, having someone pay him to just do the simplest of tasks. So I really struggled with that one until him and I came to the understanding, like, I told him, I really do like the way you're playing this character, but try to make it more fun for everyone else. Try to think
yeah,
of a way that your by the money greed is fun for everyone at the table. And the very next session, he did. He took the contract he had, and because they hadn't been paying attention to it, he started to be like, "Oh, so thus far you guys owe me this much, and this much, but I will take it in the form of I owe you, or like a favor asked one time, no questions, kind of thing." So he did really find, yeah. Oh, and that worked out really wonderfully down the road, I promise you. But again, it was obstacles like that you don't want to be mean and you don't want to shut someone down. I'd say that's my biggest obstacle as a DM, is trying to get the right around for everyone.
yeah, making sure everyone feels like they're contributing in a way that kind of fulfills why they're there at the table, but also doesn't hinder anybody else's enjoyment. That's like the ultimate balancing act, right? To make sure everybody's having fun. And again, that doesn't have to always fall on the DM to take care of, but I think sometimes as a DM we feel like it's our responsibility, and that can be kind of something to overcome in and of itself. Just that feeling of guilt when not everyone's having as much fun or contributing as much as you'd like them to.
No, absolutely. And that is a struggle still to this day, again, after, 10 years of playing and writing. But I think I found my flow where I've constructed all my stories, and we joked about this earlier. I construct them all to kind of be, at the end of the day, have everyone kind of question, like, are we the baddies? I like that moral question of what is right, what is wrong, and just having players play with that understanding of we talked about it in the campaign we played a bit ago, that evil isn't necessarily as black and white as it seems to be, and I like to really play with that idea and question their moralities. What is a big edge you put into your writing?
I like that sort of ambiguity, that like the questioning of reality. I take that to maybe more of a literal sense. I'm a big fan of Cthulhu mythos, like that that fear of the unknown. There's something out there that is just so alien and unknowable that at the end of the day, like it leaves you questioning everything and even questioning your own sanity, maybe.
Well,
I
try
and
that one's great
because
like I personally have that feeling with the oceans. They're just so vast and mass. Like we have no idea what's in our own ocean. So that Lovecraftian idea of these terror monsters, I get why it works, because it just kind of hits that primal fear, like deep seated in us. So I really like that you do work that into your stories. I don't really dwell into the horror myself, probably because it's not something I've ever practiced with.
Well, it's one of those things, again, if you take your own interests and your own hobbies and put them on the table, and that's going to be what easily translates to probably the best quality product, right? Mm-hmm. For me, Cthulhu mythos and horror are some of my bigger interests. So to put those on the table, I can pretty consistently get a good product that keeps people coming back. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and if that's, at the end of the day, my big thing is, do I have the same players at my table for the next session, continuing the story? Yes, we're doing it right. Something is being done right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Taylor, we're kind of running into the end of the show here, but I do have a few more questions for you. As much as we've been giving praise and love to Dungeons and Dragons here, we've mentioned we both played a few of the editions. I personally had played 5th edition, 4th edition, and I've read on the other editions but never had the chance to play them. But there's so many different tabletop role-playing games out there nowadays. Have you had experience with any other ones yourself? I know personally the only one I've dove into myself is the Star Wars tabletop playing game.
Right. I've played quite a few, actually. As I said, I started my journey into role-playing games with a club that had a lot of people running different games in it. I would say the first role-playing game that I actually built a character in and went to, more than one session for was Shadowrun, which is to this day is still a pretty good system. I think they're on the 6th edition now, or I think the new edition is called the 6th World. And I bought the source book for it a while ago, and I read most of it, and I haven't got together to put a session together, but I had a lot of my players telling me, oh, we're really hyped for Cyberpunk. Hindsight on that, but they were really hyped for Cyberpunk, and they wanted to play something similar in a role-playing game, so I got the materials for that, just never put anything together because I had another D&D game that took precedent.
So why do you think Dungeons and Dragons seems to be the go-to and the one everyone comes back to with so much variety out there?
I would say because it's popular in the media. I think a lot of people have like a touchstone for it or an expectation now.
Which is so ironic, as it started as the opposite of popular in the media.
I think they call it the world's most popular or like the world's best role-playing game now, right? So...
Yeah, that makes sense. And the fact it's under Daddy Hasbro's belt now guarantees they're going to just keep pumping it out.
Yeah, a lot of people like 5th edition for how sleek and how easy to learn it is relative to the previous editions. So right. I think that's a big part of it too. Reading the Shadowrun book for the newest edition of that, I DM D&D once a week, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. And reading the Shadowrun rules hurt my brain a little bit.
Yeah.
So I can see the barriers, right?
And I kind of had the opposite, where when I tried to get into Pathfinder, I just found it was just D&D but lacking. And that's not me trying to nag on Pathfinder, because I have a lot of friends who like it and actually prefer it to Dungeons and Dragons. But just to my taste, I found that at the end of the day, I just kept coming back to D&D.
Yeah, and I think you have to pick a system that works for the kind of game you want to run. You know, if you want to run around shooting guns and playing in a modern world, well, D&D is not the best place to start.
Though, with that being said, they do have the tools for it in the books that allow you to structure your world however you see fit. But I do feel like, yes, if you want to play sci-fi in space, as much as D&D gives you the resources, it's not the game to do it around, because as a DM, I've tried it, and you literally have to reskin the entire game, which is just a daunting task. It's endless work, and it wasn't satisfying in the slightest.
Yeah, it can be an uphill battle, right? If you're not using the right tool, that's just kind of the way anything is. You know, if you have the right tool, it makes the job a lot easier. But sometimes teaching people to use the right tools is an uphill battle too. So you got to kind of weigh those options. But there's a lot out there. I mean, if you want like superhero stuff, I forget what the superhero game's called, but there's a really popular one. There's one called Kids on Bikes that's got that like 80s like kids getting in over their heads sort of flair to it.
I've heard of that one actually gaining a lot of momentum, and I've been meaning to check that one out as well.
Yeah, same.
And there's another one that the name is slipping me, but it's almost like your typical 80s slasher film, where you choose like what kind of teenager you are, and it's in the woods, and it's very slasher film. And I've been hearing about that one more and more too, and have been very interested in it.
Yeah, and I think the publishers of these these games are getting better at explaining the rules. And usually they have supplements like YouTube channels, or you can at least watch an independent group play it. So it kind of gives you that idea of what the machine is supposed to look like at the end.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I just bit the bullet to start DMing and, dove deep. But with how many years have passed and the popularity that has come to Dungeons and Dragons, I find that if you want to start to DM, it's easier than ever. And now with everyone being stuck at home due to the current global crisis, with things like Zoom or even Roll20, which is a complete tabletop simulator, there's just so many ways to actually stay connected and keep playing. What advice would you have for anyone looking to become a DM or even a player right now for Dungeons and Dragons?
I would say get out there and start seeing what the communities are like, and find the one that kind of suits your interests. Like you said before, Reddit is a great place to start. Roll20 has a looking for group system built into it. So, I mean, if you don't know anybody or you're kind of afraid to ask people in your friend group if they want to play, I'm pretty sure you can find strangers like to play with anytime on Roll20.
Yeah, so you can just queue up with anyone in Roll20. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, it might, it's a real crapshoot as to what you're going to get, but I think that's just D&D and tabletop role-playing games in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, and honestly, my advice to anyone listening who's looking to start playing Dungeons and Dragons or even to DM is reach out to someone who's played. They'll have the most advice for you. And YouTube, honestly, YouTube and Reddit, there's just so many resources that streamline the ideas and make it easy to digest, that if you're into role playing, if you like improv and just having a good time with friends, I couldn't suggest any other game more than Dungeons and Dragons. I have a love eternal for it that will never die.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a great hobby, and there's more out there to support you than ever before, and it's just growing in popularity all the time. So might as well get started.
Absolutely. Well, Taylor, I think we're running into the end here. I thank you so much for being with us today on the very first podcast. It means so much to me. And I actually think I had so much fun talking about this. Maybe we'll have a reoccurring segment where we actually dive in a bit deeper to Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe we can have a segment that helps be new DMs. Maybe we can teach new DMs.
Oh man, I'd be happy to be a part of that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, buddy.
All right, take care, man. Thanks for having me.
Today's episode made possible by friends of the channel, Dream Sauce Design Company for the logo and banner of the channel, as well as Neats for episode 1's artwork. Find their links in the description below. Thanks for stopping in, and I'll catch you all next time.